And our Bible reading this week is taking us back to the Old Testament, back to the book of Daniel. Fortunately, you took us to the easier first half of Daniel.
No visions today.
Than the thorny second part of Daniel. If you haven't read beyond the chapter 6, you need to do that. But chapter 3 may be one of the most familiar stories.
Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah. And I guess you have in mind as the good work here, their courageous stand against the cultural pressure
and the death threats
to bow the knee to the king's image.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Remember, this is the story of the counterpart is the fiery furnace. We all remember our kids' Bible class illustrations of that. Kids come home with something that's usually red and yellow from that day in class because of the fiery furnace, and they were thrown into it. But the real for us, it's the cultural pressure. They literally stood up when everybody else bowed down. But I, David, am particularly fascinated by their conversation with Nebuchadnezzar. Not only does it reflect courage, but they recognize that while God can deliver them from suffering this worldly consequences for their stand for God, there's no guarantee that God will. And they acknowledge that. They, when they are going to the fiery furnace, don't know whether God's going to save them. Yet whether or not God bails us out in this life does not change the fact that they're going to do what's right simply because it's right.
It seems to me there's a broader lesson there about good works, of which this is one kind of application. And that broader lesson would be that you don't always get a payoff.
That's right.
For the good that you do. In other words, what I mean by that is I do good, and in the moment I get this reward. Kind of like when Joseph stands against Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39.
Right. Does the right thing.
What he got in the moment
was years in prison.
Yeah, was years in prison.
That's right.
And yet it was still the right thing. It was still a good
right.
work. It was still standing against the pressure. But in the moment it didn't feel that way. And I think even in a broader picture than that, I think sometimes like the hypocrites of Jesus' day, we do things because we want a reward or glory in the moment, rather than being content with God is pleased and I have brought him glory, which is my purpose.
Well, that's right. I think that's one of the things I like about the lists of all the people who come back from exile is a really weird example of what you're talking about, which is you look at all those names like in Ezra or, and they don't, you have no idea who they are or what they did. They're literally unknown to history otherwise, except for these lists. But the point is they're known to God because they did something that was good. And that's what matters. God knows their name and more importantly, what they did. And so that's the thing is we can't judge the good works that we're doing by immediate outcomes right now. That is not the measure where something was a good work or not.
In fact, we ought to add to that. In fact, another piece of this would be that sometimes the consequence of doing a good work is suffering. For example, think about the courageous work of going and confronting a brother with sin.
That's right.
Which is, I think, one of the most important things you can do. And yet we all know how often does that end up going badly?
Right.
Someone gets angry with us, or maybe someone who was a friend is alienated from us because we said, look, I'm worried there's sin in your life.
Right.
And yet the thing is, even if someone gets angry with us and resents it, and relationships are forever tense and uncomfortable, it was still the right thing.
Right.
And still a good work, even though in the moment it may not feel like it.
No, that's exactly right.
So we ought to ponder that, I guess, as we work in Daniel 3, to look at what happened to these guys when they stand up and do the right thing, and to recognize sometimes that's how it is for us too. That doesn't mean our works aren't good. It just means that we may have to wait a little while longer to have them acknowledged
to see the
God.
fruit of them.
Yeah, ponder that as you read this week.